Hi everybody, so in this video we're going to review the APA ethical standards for research that do build off of the different principles we've covered regarding ethics, right? But specifically for psychologists. Now, just as a reminder, APA stands for the American Psychological Association. That's the association that you all will belong to if you go into psychology, if you stay in the field. This is your organization. So keep that in mind. These are the standards that they put out. I'm going to focus on a few key standards, so keep that in mind. I'm not going to cover all of them. If you're interested in knowing more and learning more about the standards, you can see it in the chapter Have I Signed, or you can go to APA's website. The first one being the requirement for a review board, right? So this requirement requires that each study be reviewed by a team of not just researchers, people for ethics and weighing and balancing. Well, is the research and the potential harm to participants, is it worth the risk, right? They're taking the risk into account when assessing this study. So the members of this committee have to include one scientist, have to include a community member, and may include a non-scientist, but sometimes that's covered by that community member. So why are why these requirements? So the researcher, obviously, you need an expert in the field, at least in science, that can weigh, well, do they really need to take this approach? Do they really need to use deception? Is that really required given what they want to study? So let's say I'm interested in seeing, do students prefer studying on a tablet or on paper? So every study needs to go through an internal review board review, or IRB. Every university, every college has this. Interestingly enough though, private institutions like corporations aren't required to have an IRB. I don't know about why that is, but universities and colleges are required by federal law to have this committee that reviews all studies before they collect data. Specifically, any study having to do with humans, right? So in an internal review board, you have several members. You have a scientist, you have to have at least one scientist, and you have to have a non-scientist as part of the group. This often satisfies the requirement to have a community member. So this community member, this non-scientist, their role is to make sure that the scientists are keeping in mind the well-being of the community, take the perspective of potential participants, and see, well, do they feel comfortable? Do they feel like some ethical boundaries are being crossed? Do they feel that any deception covered in that study or included in that study was necessary considering what the scientist is trying to find out? So then you have the researcher, and their role is to assess the science behind it. Similarly, they take into account, well, does it fit what the scientist is trying to look for? But then they take the role of the expert and really look into the design of the study and assess it based on that perspective, and also keeping in mind the ethics and the human component of the study, right? Are we taking care of our participants? Are we making sure they're safe? Are there any ethical boundaries we're crossing in the study? Including, for example, are we really giving participants a choice if we're offering them too much? That might sound weird, right? We are offering them compensation for their time. You often see that you get a $20 gift card for an hour of your time. But let's say it was a $1,000 gift card and it was to participate in a very dangerous situation. Now, is that ethical when you're offering that to a student? You're offering them this much money. It's a population that might be more inclined to take it. Say you did this in a low-income community as well. Is it ethical when they're in a situation where they're inclined to take it despite the risk? That's something that IRB would have to weigh. So every scientist has to do this at every university before they collect data with humans. And then if we're doing research with a prisoner population, you need to have somebody that can take the perspective and advocate for the prisoners. because this is a vulnerable population, right? Similarly, if you're focusing on recruiting children, your study might get extra review because the IRB is concerned with vulnerable populations. Are you making sure that you're asking not only well, it's not called consent, assent from children. That's what they call it when you're asking children for confirmation that they're willing to participate. Are you asking for consent from the parent, right? Because that's the guardian, right? So they're reviewing your study, making sure you're not violating any ethical boundaries, making sure that you're weighing the risks and the benefits of your study, right? So even if the risk is just, well, you might waste somebody's time, or they might get very bored doing the study. So it's a 2-hour survey. Well, they might look at your study and ask, well, okay, are those 2 hours that participant is spending on your study, does that make sense given what you're finding out, right? Is it actually in line with your research question, right? Your design and what you're doing. They take that onto account and assess whether this study should be carried out. So then every study also needs to have informed consent, right? So informed consent means they have to agree to participate to your study, right? That's the consent part. But what about the informed part? So in your study, you're going to see that you're going to have a consent form that participants are going to read through and agree to. And this form is going to explain to the participants primarily the potential risk of participating and what exactly is it that they're going to be doing during this time, right? So these potential risks can be as little as you might get bored, but they might seem, some studies might seem innocuous, like there's no risk. But sometimes even having open-ended questions might lead the participant to revealing something that is harmful or revealing or traumatic for them, right? So if you're asking about a student questions about any challenges they've had in their first year of college, you have to put in there as a risk that you might be asked to recall or review memories or experiences that have made you feel uncomfortable, right? So in the consent, you have to have that. You have to explain the potential risks and what is it that they're going to participate in the study. There may be some deception in the consent form. That has to be reviewed by the IRB. It has to be reviewed, but you can't deceive them about the harm they're going to put themselves in, right? So that part you cannot deceive them about. They have to know they're going to be asked to drink caffeine. They have to know this might make them feel anxious. They have to know that they're going to be responding to questions that might bring up unpleasant memories. They have to know that they're going to be asked to run for an hour and they're going to be exhausted after this. And please make sure you're in the physical shape, right? So in that case, that last example, you need further medical assessment of the participant just to make sure they're okay with doing that. But you can't deceive them about the potential risks, and you should lump in discomfort into any of those risks. So deception is something we need to really consider, and it is one of APA's ethical standards, meaning that the APA ethical standards for research ask you to take into account, well, is deception really necessary in your study? Do you really need to have deception to find that whether caffeine has an impact on participants' attention, for example? Do you really need to have deception in that situation? Well, you have to reflect and think about it, because oftentimes what I find is that students just automatically assume you need deception. Now, sometimes you might need that, right? For example, in that caffeine example, well, I don't want people to act differently, to act more alert, because they realize that I'm looking at the effects of caffeine on attention, right? But if I'm interviewing people about trauma they've experienced in living abroad, or being in the army, or studying habits, and deception really is not going to help me in understanding my question, or puts those participants at risk, meaning they participated not knowing you were going to ask them about their experience in the army or their experience with trauma, then that deception wouldn't be justified, right? So you have to take into account, well, is deception really required for my study? Do I really need that in my design for me to find what I'm looking for? And if I deceive participants, am I deceiving them about the potential risk? You can't do either of those, right? You can't deceive them about the risk. And if it's not required, if deception is not required, then you don't need it in your study design. Now, debriefing is when you tell your participants what the study was about, what you were hoping to find. If there was any deception, this is where you would reveal what you were actually looking for, right? That you were trying to see the impact of caffeine on attention. So you generally want to do the debriefing, as soon as possible. You might be able to delay it if that's required for your study design. So for example, if you're doing a longitudinal study, where you're meeting with a participant across 5 different meetings on campus or Zoom, you potentially can wait on the debriefing until the end of the semester, right? Maybe you're trying to look at, well, how does this type of tutoring or program impact student grades over the semester? Now, if you find out that there's some unexpected risk, you need to debrief them as soon as possible though, so keep that in mind. Okay, so now we're moving on to data fabrication and data falsification. So for data fabrication, the way I remember it, and the difference between the two, if you know Spanish, this actually helps. To fabrica, it means to make something, right? Okay, so now we're moving on to data fabrication and data falsification. So for data fabrication, the way I remember it, and the difference between the two, if you know Spanish, this actually helps. To fabrica, it means to make something, right? In Spanish, that's actually the term for, now I can't think of the English term. I don't know if anybody has this experience of a factory. There you go. So to fabricate something means to make something in English too, right? So you're making something up. You're fabricating the data. You're completely making up the data that was never there to begin with. There's no data was collected, and you're making it up. So data fabrication is making up your own data. Now, data falsification, similar but slightly different. Data falsification is when your interpretation of the data, you purposely misinterpret the data, misreport the data to fit your hypothesis, right? So you're expecting caffeine will have an impact on attention, and when you're rating participants, you're on purpose and consciously rating them as more attentive when they're not, right? Oh, they had their eyes open, that's attention. Oh, they looked in the direction of the video, that counts. But for the decaf group, you're like, no, that didn't count. They were just staring off above the screen. They had their eyes open, but they weren't really paying attention, right? If you're doing that, and if you're misreporting to fit your hypothesis, that's data falsification. Data fabrication, I'm making up the data. Data falsification, I'm misreporting the data on purpose. There's some issue with the analysis that I'm aware of that I'm doing on purpose to fit my hypothesis. And finally, we have plagiarism. So plagiarism, I think that's a scary topic for students. And it should be, right? Because you could get in trouble for that. But at the same time, while it's scary, most students don't know what plagiarism is. They think, well, if I don't cite that source, that's plagiarism. Yes, if you use somebody's work and don't cite them, that is plagiarism. But there's also different parts to plagiarism, different ways you can plagiarize, and you might not even be aware that you're doing this. So for example, if you take a sentence, right? If you take somebody's sentence from a textbook and you change a few words, you Google synonyms. I know there's software out there that can do this now where they'll switch out the words for different synonyms. That is still plagiarism, even if you cite them. So even if you include a citation, a reference to the original author, and you took their sentence, slightly modified it, that's still plagiarism because you're passing off their writing as your own when the only thing you really did was change out words for synonyms or change a few words. So keep that in mind. When people mention in academia, in any field, when they mention paraphrase, put it in your own words, it doesn't mean copy that sentence and change a few words. It means look at that idea, put it away just for, to be safe, and then see if you can write it in your own words without looking at it. You won't be able to do it, or it's very difficult to do if you copy and paste and then change a few things. Now, that's different if you use a quote. If you use a quote and you then give a citation for the quote, that's not plagiarism. Note that in this class, you cannot use quotes. I want you to paraphrase everything. I want you to practice putting it in your own words. But plagiarism is passing somebody else's work as your own work. This includes copying directly and saying you wrote it. This includes copying and changing a few things and passing it as your own, even if you cite. And this especially includes, situations where you just copy and paste and don't even cite. Okay, so keep that in mind. You want to avoid plagiarism as a student. You want to avoid it in grad school and your work because that could come back and cause you some issues. In this class, specifically, I want you to be careful about plagiarism in your lit review and your discussion section. For the method and results, I actually give you the text to work off of. I actually say copy this and make a few modifications to fit your study in some sections of the method and results. But in general, you want to be careful about not plagiarizing. If you're not clear on what plagiarism is, let me know. I can walk you through it. But it's just important that you know that even if you cite, it can be plagiarism if you're using the author's words, even if you're just changing a few words.